What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back with another one of my top 10 videos, and today I'm going to be discussing the taboo, forbidden subject of raunchy sex comedies. And the reason I'm discussing this now, last week there was a new trailer for the film No Hard Feelings coming out in June.
Buongiorno!
That's my cousin. Gary, I swear to God, he's my cousin. He's my second cousin.
And I thought the Red Band trailer was pretty funny, and I have no idea if it will be considered a raunchy sex comedy because I haven't seen the final product. But I saw a lot of people kind of wagging their fingers in disapproval, like how dare Jennifer Lawrence lower herself to doing a raunchy sex comedy? Shouldn't she be looking for more elevated material and that sort of thing? But for my money, there's no faster way to get me interested in a comedy than when I start hearing all the prudes out there talking about why a film is inappropriate or problematic or to be shunned or shouldn't be made in the first place. I mean, once I hear any of those conversations, I'm in, because I feel like comedy is one of those weird genres where we all kind of make a collective agreement that we're going to go a little crazy and we're going to see and hear and say some crazy shit. Things that we would not say in the classroom or in the office or at your, most loathsome family gathering. But that's what makes comedy fun, is that it is forbidden, that we are getting to step outside the lines of what's considered acceptable in order to get a little weird for a little while, and then we get to return back to reality. In a lot of ways, I look at comedies, particularly sex comedies, the way I do at horror movies. They give me a thrill. Like when I watch a great horror movie, it's not because I endorse hacking people up with chainsaws or anything like that, but we are, for a brief shining moment, getting an intense, visceral thrill. And the same thing holds true with a really fantastic sex comedy. And when it comes to the definition of a sex comedy, it is a little elusive, because even if you look at all these kind of sparkling screwball comedies from the 1930s directed by people like Ernst Lubitsch or George Cukor, even when they're the most sophisticated, subtle, refined comedies imaginable, starring people like Katharine Hepburn and Cary Grant, even those comedies are about sex in the end, like people getting married, people losing their virginity, whatever the case might be. Like, it's amazing just how many movies there are in the comedy genre that are about people trying to have sex for the very first time, or getting back on the horse after a long, sexless, monogamous relationship, or whatever the case might be. And even so-called acceptable comedies or more tasteful comedies, movies like Love Actually. In the end, that entire movie, every single subplot in that flick is about people trying to get laid to one degree or another. But when it comes to raunchy sex comedies, what are the ingredients that help a film cross over into this category? Well, obviously, nudity, gratuitous nudity, inappropriate nudity, any kind of nudity you can think of usually is a great way to kind of get on the fast track to becoming a raunchy sex comedy. But back in the 80s when I was a kid, most raunchy sex comedies dealt with either high school or college kids either trying to lose their virginity and or expanding their sexual boundaries, experimenting, whatever the case might be. And looking back on the 1980s and 90s, it's incredible just how many of these movies were getting made. It reminds me quite a bit of the slasher genre, where you have a film like Halloween or Friday the 13th making so much cash that it spawns hundreds, if not thousands, of imitators. And the same holds true for sex comedies, where a movie like Porky's will make a crazy amount of money and suddenly you get 1,000 ripoffs. And with this list, I'm not trying to make the claim that it's a comprehensive list where I've looked at all the sex comedies ever made, that these are the official top 10. These are just my top 10 favorites that I've seen so far. And honestly, one of the main purposes for making this list is that I'm hoping to get a lot of cool recommendations for flicks that I've missed. So I will be discussing all my honorable mentions as well as films that I've yet to see. But as I was putting together my list, I was actually caught off guard by just how hard it was to figure out, when does a comedy stop being a comedy and slip over into like coming of age drama? Because there are a lot of flicks about people in their teens who are on the cusp of adulthood that are experimenting with their first sexual experiences, where they actually really do cross over into a really intense, moving coming of age drama. Or in some cases, you have films where the writing and the acting is so first rate, it almost feels kind of dismissive to refer to them as a raunchy sex comedy.
Mrs. Robinson, you're trying to seduce me. Aren't you?
So I'll do my best to qualify my decisions along the way. But the one thing you won't see in this video is animation. Movies like Fritz the Cat, which I really enjoyed, But I'm going to save my kind of raunchy adult animated comedies for yet another video, which I'll be making down the road. So let's just go ahead and rip off the Band-Aid and start talking about some honorable mentions that were contenders, but that will not be making this particular list. So in no particular order, here are some strong contenders that might have made the list, but just didn't quite make the cut. Wedding Crashers. I think that movie's funny as hell, and it does have nudity, but gets a little too sappy and sentimental for my tastes. Road Trip was a serious contender for people out there who like Todd Phillips and his film The Joker. The Road Trip, I believe, was his first feature film, but he might have made a documentary about fraternities first. But anyway, Road Trip was where he got started and has some first-rate nudity. Once Bitten, that's a childhood favorite, which is all about people trying to lose their virginity, but it has no nudity in it. However, the dance scene in Once Bitten is one of the sexiest dance scenes in the history of human civilization, and Jim Carrey's absolutely hysterical in it. Another childhood fave is Just One of the Guys, where it's a PG-13 with an absolute Hall of Fame nude sequence and, explores all sorts of interesting terrain when it comes to girls dressing up as men and vice versa, etc. and so forth. But it just blows my mind that movie is PG-13. Trading Places, one of my all-time favorite comedies. It has tons of nudity, but I wouldn't describe it as a sex comedy. I feel like that's almost like a class warfare comedy. It's a first-rate comedy that's wildly inappropriate and offensive to a lot of people. However, I just don't describe it as a sex comedy. I feel like I haven't done a great job of defining what a sex comedy is, but hopefully as I get close to my top films on my list, we'll zero in on what the official definition is. Malibu Express from director Andy Sidaris. It's a wild, over-the-top movie with tons of hanky-panky, but in the end, it's an action movie, so it does not make the top 10 raunchy sex comedy list. Caddyshack, that's another first-rate comedy that could have potentially made the list. However, I feel like that's one of those comedies where it's very much one of those slobs versus the snobs comedies, where we see a lot of movies like that, like Revenge of the Nerds. That's another slobs versus the snobs comedy, or nerds versus frat guys and that sort of thing. And they bleed over into the sex comedy genre, but don't quite make the cut. Getting a little bit more contemporary, Hot Tub Time Machine. Holy crap, this is a movie that includes a lot of the ingredients that go into making a great sex comedy, like ski slips. For whatever reason, in the 80s and early 90s, you had a lot of comedies that took place at ski resorts, and Hot Tub Time Machine absolutely qualifies. And Jessica Paré, who everybody loves from Mad Men, oh my God, like the scene in the hot tub in this flick, well, it has to be seen to be believed. Wet Hot American Summer, another strong contender, very sexy flick, but not quite sexy enough to be a raunchy sex comedy. Superbad, another comedy that's absolutely hysterical, and it's all about kids trying to lose their V-cards, but no nudity. I'm starting to realize as I go through my list of honorable mentions of movies that did not make the cut, I guess if it includes a nude scene where people say that's inappropriate, well, then you're well on your way to being a raunchy sex comedy. Bachelor Party, that's another classic from my childhood, featuring the great Monique Gabrielle. Blame It on Rio. Holy Christ, I mean, it has one of the most awkward scenes in movie history where Michael Caine and his best friend bump into their daughters at a nude beach or a topless beach, and they're encouraging their fathers to go into the water with them. At any rate, very funny stuff. Hard Bodies, that's kind of a weird holy grail. If you'd asked me to make this list when I was 10, I would have included Hard Bodies, because it was one of those movies like Porky's where it was like a rite of passage, whether or not you'd seen it or not. But honestly, I haven't seen Hard Bodies in like 36 years. I have no idea how well it holds up. Ski School, though. Ski School is one of those weird, ski resort sex comedies that absolutely does hold up. Super Vixens by the great Russ Meyer from the 1970s. It would have made this list, although it's not quite like comedic enough to make the list, and I only wanted to include one Russ Meyer film on the list. So we'll get to Russ Meyer later in the video. National Lampoon's Van Wilder, absolutely worth a look. National Lampoon's Animal House, also very much worth a look. But if 21st century movies are more your thing, Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle, as well as Harold and Kumar Escape from Guantanamo Bay, those movies are actually surprisingly good sex comedies that were absolutely made in the spirit of a lot of these 1980s and 1990s sleazier classics. I guess, if you want to be a raunchy sex comedy, there has to be a sleaze factor that is lacking in a movie, like going back to Love Actually. Love Actually does have nudity, and that whole movie is about people trying to get it on, but it doesn't feel sleazy. It feels very wholesome, and it feels very respectable. I feel like you could show Love Actually to the royal family and you wouldn't be embarrassed, whereas if you showed a Harold and Kumar movie, You probably would. But getting back to Hall of Fame sequences, Mischief from 1985 with Kelly Preston. It should have made the list, but I rewatched Mischief in preparation for this video. It's not a comedy. It's a coming-of-age story. It's a drama. But oh my God, if you like Kelly Preston, that is one of the greatest nude scenes in the history of cinema. And a big source of internal struggle for me was whether or not to include the movies of John Hughes. Because when I was like 9 or 10, movies like 16 Candles and Weird Science, these were major foundational experiences for our entire just 80s childhood experience when it came to the fashion sensibility, the music we listened to, the slang that we used. And for a younger kid looking at the older kids in those movies, they were very aspirational. We kind of looked up to those kids like, oh my God, like wouldn't it be cool to be one of the bad kids in a John Hughes movie? Even though we didn't know who the hell John Hughes was, we just happened to see all of his movies like Ferris Bueller and Breakfast Club, etc. But 16 Candles, even though at the time it seemed scandalous, I mean, half the movie is about people trying to look for, like, paying money to see a girl's panties. It's a PG movie. I mean, it's got a brief little nude scene in the locker room, but you cannot make a top 10 raunchy sex comedy list if you are a PG movie. Same holds true for Weird Science. It's PG-13 and is a little bit more risque, but as much as I love Weird Science and as much as it had a profound impact on my 10-year-old brain, it's just not quite raunchy enough to make the cut. But one movie that's absolutely raunchy enough, but it's just too hardcore and too gruesome in a lot of ways to make the list, is Spetters from director Paul Verhoeven. I seriously considered including Spetters because it's so outrageous and so shocking, but in the end, it's more of a coming-of-age drama than a raunchy comedy, so even though I love Spetters, it is not going to make the list. And as I mentioned before, I'm making this video partially as a way of getting recommendations from people, but here are some raunchy sex comedies that I have not seen that I absolutely should. I've never seen Loose Screws, or Screwballs, or Private Resort, or Private Lessons, Spring Break, Hot Dog the Movie, HOTS, or HOTS, I'm not even sure how you're supposed to say the title of the film, Eurotrip, My Tutor, and Preppies. I don't know if those movies are pure trash or if they're well worth a look, but once again, keep the recommendations coming because I'm always happy to make a fresh discovery. So let's get into my official list, and keep in mind I was born in 1976. The movies you see as a preteen or young teen or teenager on the cusp of adulthood, I feel like obviously those movies are going to have a disproportionate impact because you're still going through kind of your formative years where you're even figuring out what the hell sex even is in the first place. So if you see the 80s and 90s getting disproportionately favored in this list, well, first and foremost, a lot of these movies were being made then, but also I saw these movies at a very impressionable age. So for my number 10, I'm going to go a little classy before I get a little trashy. And I wanted to have a nice mix of more sophisticated sex comedies as well as really sleazy ones all on this list because even within the raunchy sex comedies subgenre, there are little mini subgenres within that. And just because of the number, I've got to go with Blake Edwards' 10 for my number 10. And honestly, the movie's so good, it could have easily been much higher on the list, but I don't know, it just felt strangely appropriate to have 10 be my number 10, which I did not see when I was 3 years old when it came out back in 1979. I discovered it much later in life, but good God. It's one of the sexiest and one of the funniest and just all-around hysterical sex comedies that I've ever seen because you've got the great Dudley Moore absolutely on fire in his comedy prime, going on vacation in Mexico after getting busted going to this nudist party by his girlfriend played by Julie Andrews, and while he's down there in Mexico, he encounters Bo Derek. This is one of those movies where it's very easy to get tongue-tied even discussing it because Bo Derek is so beautiful in this film, it will render you speechless, but there are some really funny bits like when she asks him very frankly if he ever did it to Bolero and how her step-uncle taught her to have sex to Ravel's classical music, and at any rate, you will never listen to Ravel's Bolero in the same way ever again after seeing this flick, as Bo Derek famously said, what's wrong with turning on and screwing to Bolero? But I don't want to get sidetracked just talking about my love and affection for the great Bo Derek. So let's slip into my number 9, which is easily the most offensive and the most degrading and the coarsest and most vulgar film on this list. The one that's least easy to defend, but it was so successful and so influential. You cannot make this list without including Porky's from 1981. And I have to admit, I don't even really like Porky's that much, but it was more just like when I was 9 or 10 years old, the reputation of Porky was such that you hadn't crossed over into like the next stage of human development until you had seen Porky's. At that time, it justifiably had one of the most notorious reputations imaginable. And then watching it in 2023, it's just like, oh my God, I mean, because it takes place at a 1950s high school in Florida, it has characters that represent just about every reprehensible attitude that one can imagine. And what's hysterical is that the guy who made this, he would follow it up with, first and foremost, a sequel to Porky's, but he would also make A Christmas Story only 2 years later. So, yeah, Bob Clark proved that he could make the most sleazy film imaginable and the most wholesome film imaginable, all within the span of 2 years. But I should mention that in spite of people wagging their fingers in disapproval of this film, it was the 5th highest grossing movie of 1981. It was not some obscure film off on the fringes of society. And about 15 years later, or actually even less than that, like 10 or 12 years later, one of the actors from the film, Roger Wilson, came and spoke to my high school about the dramatic arts. So, of course, everyone in my high school who had not seen Porky's as part of the rite of passage had to go back and revisit it. So even though in 2023 I find huge chunks of this movie to be kind of dull, kind of boring, I will admit there's one scene with Kim Cattrall, long before Sex and the City, where she gets it on with a fellow gym teacher that is absolutely sizzling. And also, I will go to bat for this film, where I'll say that beneath all the offensive material and all the objectionable language and all that stuff, there actually is a very inspiring, moving story about a young Jewish kid facing a lot of anti-Semitism, standing up for himself and taking on the bullies. And then we see one of those bullies having a massive change of heart and standing up to the father who taught him all those intolerant views in the first place. So even with one of the most reprehensible films imaginable, you can still find a way to deliver a positive social message beneath all that filth and depravity. But I've said enough about Porky's at this point. Let's move on to one of the most successful sleazy sex comedies ever made, American Pie from 1999. This movie was made for $11 million and it had $235 million in box office. I mean, that has to make it one of the most profitable films that I've ever heard of. But like so many raunchy sex comedies, this is a movie about several friends in high school trying to lose their virginity before they go to college. And I can remember being in a theater in the summer 1999 with my entire family where the reaction from the crowd was just thunderous. I mean, the walls were shaking with laughter, and people of all ages were having a blast watching this. It launched the careers of tons of young starlets, and admittedly, many of them were already well on their way due to other movies, but this was one of those seismic cultural events where it launched many sequels, and it's just amazing to me that more movies like this aren't getting made today, because I know obviously Hollywood right now is all about doing PG-13, kind of escapist fantasy movies like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but those movies are extremely expensive to make, and they're not always a success, as we've seen with Quantumania. I just feel like, $11 million movies that generate hundreds of millions. Hollywood needs to rediscover their love and affection for the raunchy sex comedy. So getting back to the whole incentive for making this video in the first place, I hope that No Hard Feelings will do well and launch a whole raunchy sex comedy revival.
So when you say date him, do you mean date him or date him?
Yes.
Date him. Date him hard.
Okay. I'll date his brains out.
But moving on to my number 7, I've got Private School, and I've got the Blu-ray right here, signed by the star Matthew Modine. And in my opinion, when it comes to 80s raunchy comedies, it's tough to beat Private School. I mean, you've got a Hall of Fame lineup of young starlets who never looked better, actresses like Betsy Russell and Phoebe Cates. But you've got shower scenes, you've got flaming poop jokes, you've got slow dances with ass grabs and people trying to conceal their boners. You've got cross-dressing, you've got erotic literature, you've got nude horseback riding, you've got girls mooning their teachers at their graduation. You've even got the lovely Sylvia Christel as the sex teacher. It kind of is the perfect storm of all the ingredients that go into making a great 80s raunchy sex comedy. And if you have not seen it, I'm not going to claim that it's some, earth-shattering film with great writing or whatever the case might be, but you will definitely be entertained from start to finish. And when it comes to raunchy sex comedies, that's enough. And for my number 6, we have yet another one of those movies from the early 80s that is oftentimes credited with launching the popularity of this whole subgenre. Obviously, Porky's had beaten it to market by 1 year, but The Last American Virgin from 1982, holy crap, this movie holds up really well. It's written and directed by Boaz Davidson, and it's actually a remake of his film from 1978, Eskimo Lemon, which he'd made in Israel. But this is one of the key early success stories by producers Golan and Globus from Canon Films, and they were basically just trying to replicate the success they'd had in Israel in the United States, and the plot and the characters are more or less the exact same. The original film was set in 1950s Israel, and obviously the new movie is set in the early 80s in Los Angeles. But I recently revisited the film, and I was blown away by how well it still plays. I mean, the soundtrack is absolutely fucking awe-inspiring. I mean, if you like Blondie or The Cars or REO's Speedwagon, if you're into early 80s love songs, oh my god, like Last American Virgin will absolutely blow your mind. But I think one of the reasons this movie plays so well all these decades later is that it has all these really down-to-earth, really almost like grittily authentic scenes that will remind people of their own childhood, even if it's a little over the top, like when a bunch of boys in the locker room have a dick measuring contest for this giant pool of cash, or when a bunch of young boys meet an older woman who wants to deflower all of them, and we see how terrified the boys are. But what gives this film its soul and kind of elevates it above some of its trashy competitors, it has this unmistakable, heartbreaking sense of ache and longing. The hero, Gary, played by, what the hell is this actor's name? Lawrence Monason. He's pining for the character Karen, played by Diane Franklin, but of course, Karen only has eyes for Gary's friend, who is a total prick and a total asshole, a guy who absolutely does not deserve Karen. But that is a tale as old as time itself, where you've got the nice guy who's more or less like a brother to a girl that he's in love with, and of course the girl only has eyes for the guy who is a total prick. So I feel like any man who has ever yearned for or longed for a girl that he can never have, you will find this film to be strangely moving, in addition to being absolutely hysterical. Like when three young guys all get crabs from the same girl, and they go to the neighborhood pool because they want to try to drown the crabs by staying submerged underwater for several hours. But this movie almost didn't make the list because the jokes vanish entirely in the last 30 minutes, and it does get pretty serious, and it does venture into kind of coming-of-age drama, but the first hour is so funny, it absolutely made the cut. But it's time to get into our top 5, and you cannot make a list like this without including the films of John Landis. He made many classic comedies, many of which have absolutely first-rate nude scenes. I mean, Trading Places, American Werewolf in London, National Lampoon's Animal House. But the movie of his that I'm including on this list is the Kentucky Fried Movie from 1977. And there are a couple of sketch comedy movies that beat it to the punch. Movies like Groove Tube, which is another strong contender that I should have mentioned in my honorable mentions. I love Groove Tube. But with Kentucky Fried Movie, you've got the writers that would go on to make movies like Airplane and Naked Gun, combined with the directorial talents of John Landis, which is kind of a comedy perfect storm. And there are many funny sequences in this movie, like one of the best is the Wonderful World of Sex segment, where we see a couple experimenting while listening to a how-to guide on the record player. But of course, the guy has premature ejaculation, which means that Big Jim Slade has to step in and get the job done. But the reason the movie is making the list is because of Catholic High School Girls in Trouble. And all I can say about Catholic High School Girls in Trouble is that it is 2 minutes of comedy gold featuring the lovely Ushi Degard, but it is a fake trailer for a porn film which never got made. But holy crap, if all the people involved with this film ever wanted to reunite to make a feature film of Catholic High School Girls in Trouble, I would watch it.
The screen has never dared to be so explicit.
Show me your nuts.
Oh, how you doing? Surfing your face.
But moving on to my number 4, we finally get to the subject of the great Russ Meyer. And Russ Meyer is one of my all-time favorite filmmakers who's made many really entertaining kind of drive-in movies, exploitation films, etc. He's one of the most successful independent filmmakers who ever lived, and he was frequently accused of being a pornographer, in spite of the fact that a lot of his movies, like his most famous movies like Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, don't even have any nudity. So I feel like those accusations were a little unfair. However, toward the end of his career, he did make one movie that kind of slipped over into the pornographic terrain, and it is the movie that is going to make this list. But Beneath the Valley of the Ultra-Vixens, which is the third film in his Vixens trilogy, which started with Vixen, went on to Super Vixens, and then led to this. And actually, Beneath the Valley of the Ultra-Vixens is the reason why I have a podcast. A couple of friends of mine and I went to see a revival of this film at the Anthology Film Archives here in New York, and the crowd was just going fucking berserk and laughing and rolling in the aisles. And afterwards, we went out for a drink, and we were just having a good time talking about flicks. And I was like, you know what? What if we started a podcast where we talk about film history, et cetera, and so forth? Anyway, that led to Wrong Reel, which eventually led to this channel. So all roads lead back to Russ Meyer and Beneath the Valley of the Ultra-Vixens. But in the words of Russ Meyer, this film is a horny little tale of Olympian togetherness, faith-healing, bra-busting humor, jogging, therapeutic cuckolding, and for the girls, hulking Herculean masculinity. I mean, who can argue with that? But the plot of this movie is absolutely ridiculous, and it absolutely earns its X rating, where you have a woman trying to cure her husband of his obsession with anal sex, to be perfectly crass or candid or vulgar. And she's basically trying to get him back on the straight and narrow path of doing it the old-fashioned way, the way that she likes. But when it comes to social satire and just poking fun at and or celebrating small-town life in America, this is one of the most outrageous comedies that I've ever seen, and I strongly recommend that everybody hunt it down. But moving on to my number 3, we have a movie which sold a hell of a lot of Ray-Ban sunglasses, and we have a young movie star who is still very much relevant here in 2023, although he's more famous now for doing stunts as opposed to making love to beautiful women. But we have Risky Business, starring Tom Cruise, written and directed by Paul Brickman. This movie is one of those cultural phenomenons that it's hard to overstate its influence on the culture at that time, where you have a young high school student going through all the trials and tribulations of trying to get into college, where he almost kind of stumbles into falling in love with a prostitute and starting a really successful business where they essentially are playing matchmaker between all these working girls and all these virginal high school boys. And the movie is just fucking outrageously entertaining. Rebecca De Mornay, oh my God, she was never more sexy, never more confident. Tom Cruise, I mean, you can tell he's got movie star written all over him, but it's got all this killer like Phil Collins music. And you could probably make a case that this movie is not a comedy, that once again, it's more a movie about growing up and so on and so forth. But I laugh like hell when I'm watching this movie, and there's no denying the fact that it's one of the sexiest films ever made. So yeah, Risky Business absolutely had to make the list. And for my number 2, we have a movie which, in my opinion, will always remain the all-time GOAT when it comes to high school sex comedies, and that is Fast Times at Ridgemont High, directed by Amy Heckerling, written by Cameron Crowe, and starring the very lovely Jennifer Jason Leigh and Phoebe Cates. What can you say about this movie that has not already been said a million times over? But I think this is the best, high school sex comedy that we will ever see. It's raunchy, it's moving, it's aspirational, it's incredibly authentic. It just captures a unique time and place that we will never see again when it comes to that like weird SoCal, early 80s mall culture or suburban culture. And they just hit that perfect home run where everything about it works, from the casting to the writing to the music. It's just absolutely fantastic. And when it comes to on-screen, titillation or nudity, I mean, Phoebe Cates coming out of the pool while Judge Reinhold is having a wank in the bathroom, fucking hilarious. Or that scene in the pool house between Jennifer Jason Leigh and Robert Romanus, where the character Mike has to wrestle with that age-old predicament where you are finally lucky enough to be in a pool house with a beautiful naked lady and you experience premature ejaculation. And I feel like there's nothing more bruising or humiliating to a young man's confidence than going through that. However, it's kind of like writing fiction, where you have to write 1,000 bad stories before you can finally write a good one. I feel like Young Men and Sex, it's a very similar phenomenon where you have to kind of embarrass and humiliate yourself about 1,000 times before you can finally do the dirty deed appropriately. And I feel like that scene perfectly captures that phenomenon. And for my number 1, we're going to veer back into classy territory over trashy territory, although it was accused of being trashy when first released. But we're going to talk about Carnal Knowledge from 1971, directed by the great Mike Nichols. And I could have easily included Mike Nichols' more famous movie, The Graduate, on this list. I feel like The Graduate, it absolutely should have been part of this list, but I didn't want to double dip with any one filmmaker. So in spite of the fact that The Graduate is absolutely hysterical and incredibly sexy and just an absolute era-defining movie that was incredibly influential on the culture, I prefer Carnal Knowledge mostly due to the screenplay by Jules Feiffer as well as the performance by Jack Nicholson. But in so many ways, I feel like this movie is the most brutal and withering and cynical dissection of sexual relationships that I have ever seen. And some people are going to say that filmmakers like Woody Allen have done a better job of that with all their romantic comedies, but this is a raunchy sex comedy video, and Woody Allen didn't include nudity in his movies, but Carnal Knowledge does, because you've got one of the sexiest women of all time, Anne Margaret, going on what might be my favorite date ever captured on film, where she and Jack Nicholson are flirting. It's like some of the best flirtation scenes that I've ever seen. But when they finally go home and finally do the dirty deed, There's this incredible moment where Jack Nicholson ad-libs the line, "I almost came that time."
Well, I almost came that time.
And you can see that Anne Margaret's so caught off by the line, she just starts howling and cackling and just screaming with glee. But it just feels so honest, and it feels so true, and it feels so authentic. And I feel like one of the main reasons that I dislike a lot of romantic comedies is that they feel inauthentic. They feel like they're selling you on a message, or they're selling you on a type of relationship that really only exists in people's imaginations, which is probably why I despise most romantic comedies. I feel like they're selling a fantasy that you can never actually achieve. I feel like romantic comedies and porn in a lot of ways have a lot in common in that respect. Carnal Knowledge is seeking truth, but it also is seeking to entertain, and I just think it's one of the most biting and satisfying films of the early 70s, my favorite era of filmmaking. But I think that's about all I have to say on this topic for the time being. I just hope that the genre will make a comeback. I feel like we're coming to the tail end of a period where Hollywood overindulged in branded content, these giant franchises, whether you're talking Star Wars or Marvel or DC or whatever the case might be. And it came at the expense of all the other genres out there. And, I love seeing superheroes and science fiction and that sort of thing. But I also love horror and comedy and, war films or whatever the case might be. I feel like anytime show business is neglecting any form of storytelling, well, that's a missed opportunity. And also, underserved audiences usually will react wildly in favor of a good movie if they've been neglected for a long time. So we shall see if sex comedies can make a comeback in the years to come. But I am rambling at this point. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell, and hunting me down on Twitter at Geeking Out. And yeah, can't thank you enough for watching. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.